This seminar concerns one of the pressing health challenges of our time, cancer. And there's no person better qualified to update us on the progress in fighting this pervasive disease. No one better than our guest presenter today, Professor David Currow. David is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences and a past President of the Clinical Oncological Society of Australia and Palliative Care Australia. He has served on the American Society of Clinical Oncology Working Party on Palliative Care Education and chaired the Working Party for the Union of International Cancer Control on Palliative Care for the United Nations Summit on Non-Communicable Diseases. David was the Foundation Chief Executive Officer of Cancer Australia, the Commonwealth's Cancer Control Agency, before becoming the New South Wales Chief Cancer Officer and CEO of the Cancer Institute New South Wales in 2010. David and his team of 200 people look at ways to improve cancer rates through prevention, such as tobacco control and UV protection, cancer screening, improved service performance, better reporting and development, such as through population-based cancer registries, and strategic research and investments. Work in these key areas means that the Cancer Institute New South Wales is better placed to decrease the incidence of cancer, increase survival rates for people diagnosed with cancer, and improve the quality of care for people with cancer. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Currow.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak at this breakfast seminar. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to welcome any people from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander communities who are here today. The bottom line for us all is that cancer affects us. One way or another, all of us have had our lives touched by cancer. The question is, what can we do about it? What is being done about it? And what does the future look like? And so with that in mind, we've got an opportunity today to think about cancer across our community. I want to start by saying this is the amalgamation of tens of thousands of individual stories. And I don't want to lose that. It's very easy to aggregate numbers, and it's crucial that we do, as you'll see this morning. But for every one of those numbers, it's a person affected in their lives, affecting the people around them, affecting the communities in which they live. And so this is the amalgamation of those stories in order to better understand how we can improve cancer outcomes now and into the future. And so as we think about that, we have the Cancer Institute New South Wales, the government's commitment to the people of New South Wales to improve cancer outcomes systematically. And unlike much of what you see in the press, the legislation that generated the Cancer Institute New South Wales was passed with the absolute support of both houses of Parliament. And that's tremendously important, 16 years on, to say, what have we achieved and where are we taking this? As Chris said in his introduction, and it's tremendously important to reflect on it, our act as a statutory body is surprisingly simple. Reduce the incidence of cancer, that is, the number of people who will be diagnosed with cancer. Increase survival for people who are diagnosed with cancer. Improve the quality of life for people who have cancer, and provide advice to government. That's it. That's all we need to do. And I must confess, when my predecessor signed a performance agreement saying that in his time he was going to decrease the incidence of cancer, frankly, from the other side of the country, I thought he was mad. But we'll see that that is possible, and it is being achieved systematically across our community. We have a community which is blessed with extraordinarily committed clinicians. from primary care, general practitioners, nurses, allied health practitioners, through to hospital-based practitioners. We have a wonderful community of committed health professionals. But they need a health system in which to optimally deliver the best possible outcomes. And it's through that that we can see some of the greatest advances that we can take today. There are two conversations that occur out there. The first of the conversations is one of spectacular new discoveries. And I think rather like the television show for all of the stars with whom we grew up, which I think is titled Where Are They Now? We need another series for some of those spectacular discoveries that make news for a day. Where are they now? Because I want to focus on the second, which is how do we increase access to current best evidence in order to systematically improve outcomes. It's not nearly as exciting, it's not headline-worthy, but it's actually where we can make the greatest difference. It's very difficult to find the citation for it, but the former chief executive of the International Agency for Research in Cancer quoted that if we applied the knowledge we have today, no new medications, no new therapies, no new procedures, we would improve cancer outcomes by between 10 and 15%. Now, there are very few therapies that come up for subsidy consideration that are of any way like that magnitude of benefit. And so I want to focus on the things that are not headline-worthy today, but are making an appreciable difference for us today in our community. Now, I want to apologise to Joanne Lynn from the Rand Corporation. Who here wants to die from cancer? Quick show of hands. Well, I've got one taker. Thank you very much. I think you will actually reflect on what a prescient decision that is. Who here wants to die of heart disease? Okay, I've got one taker there. All right. End-stage respiratory disease? So the rest of you want to die of inanition and dementia. Because frankly, they're the choices. And across the century here, we have the impact of disease on our community. We can see the massive reduction in death from respiratory diseases in the first half of the 20th century. We can see the amazing disappearance of infectious diseases to a point that it almost reaches the asymptote. We can see that deaths from cancer appear, if you blow up the scale on the y-axis, to be starting to come down. And look at the red or magenta in circulatory diseases. People my age are no longer dying of acute myocardial infarctions as they were 40 years ago. And so as a community, we have to think about what this means for us all. And we'll come back to that as we think about the nature of cancer in a few minutes' time. So, by broad cause of death, massive changes in the 20th century, and our investment in simple things, clean water, predictable nutrition, vaccination for childhood diseases, the invention of antibiotics, has made an enormous and sustained difference. In the second half of the 20th century, realising that we were living long enough to get lifestyle diseases was an important step forward. So how are we doing? When we look across our community, we can see that in every age group, cancer outcomes over the last 40 years have improved. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that some of the best outcomes throughout that time have been in adolescents and young adults. Fantastic outcomes, outcomes that can genuinely give us hope for the future. and that importantly, as we look to our communities, some of the biggest gains have been in paediatrics. And when we look at the research efforts in New South Wales, we can be extremely proud on the international stage for extraordinary work that is leading paediatric cancer research in this state. If we look internationally, and this is just 4 cancers to illustrate it, where countries came together, put all of their data into a single analytic cauldron and asked one team to look at our performance. Australia, in this case New South Wales and Victoria, fares incredibly well. Across lung cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer and ovarian cancer, we are right up there. And you can see on this slide countries where you would not want to be diagnosed with that same cancer, where your outcomes are predictably 10 to 15% worse at 1 year and indeed at 5 years. So every country has improved, but they haven't really changed their position. And part of the challenge for us this morning is to think, what are the key success factors that give us some of the best cancer outcomes in the world? And I think that's something on which we need to reflect very carefully. Anyone having a birthday today? The chances are that at least one of you is having a birthday, and there's actually a slightly better than statistical chance that 2 of you are having a birthday, which is really strange given the size of the audience. Anyone? No? Yesterday? Tomorrow. Thank you. We'll take tomorrow. Why are birthdays important when we talk about cancer? Our greatest single risk factor for getting cancer is having birthdays. And until we can cure having birthdays, we've got a problem. Because you and I replicate billions of cells each day. And the mechanism for making sure that that replication is perfect wears out over time. And we've got some of the world's great leaders in that science, not only in New South Wales, but here today. And as we think about that, we're living long enough to get cancer, that those infectious diseases are not killing us, that those cardiovascular diseases of acute myocardial infarction or heart attack and stroke are not killing us. And so we're living long enough to get cancer for the vast majority of the population. And we see that here, that if we look in absolute terms, this is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly a fact of ageing. And so as we think about that, we need to put in perspective our efforts to improve outcomes. And here is the opportunity for us as we think at a systems level. So what about our 5-year all-cause survival? Across New South Wales, in the years 24 to 2008, we have the grey diamonds here for a number of cancers, and it really is probably not terribly material which of those cancers we're talking about. But importantly, have we improved? And so the dark blue diamonds tell us that yes, we have. That in all of those cancers, in the next quinquennium, we see an improved 5-year survival. That's not an accident. And it's not just new technology. As I said at the beginning, we have to have a conversation about how we get today's evidence into practice today to realise the full benefits of all of the advances that are being made. And if that were the end of that slide, that would be a great news story. But it's not. Because they're the variations that we see within our state by postcode of residence. That within our state, there are differences across our communities, and they're complex. They're complex. They're about our lifestyle choices. They're about our health literacy, the health choices that we choose to make. They are, in part, about a whole lot of issues about decision-making when you are concerned you have cancer. But that variation is a variation that we need to address, that we need to be lessening systematically the postcode lottery across our community if we are to realise the full potential of the therapies that are available to us in treating cancer today. And so we come to screening. This is the 50th year since the screening principles were put up by the World Health Organization. Now, in science, 50 years is a couple of lifetimes of work. And to have principles that were enunciated 50 years ago that still hold water today is an extraordinary thing. And these principles are still just as important in 2018 as they were in 1968. And we need to understand them as we think about screening, because Australia has just 3 national screening programs: breast cancer, cervical cancer, and bowel cancer. Why? Because they actually fulfil all of these criteria. And we don't need to go through the criteria in detail this morning. The important point is that we have, as a country, made a decision to follow those particular screening parameters. And so it's not just about finding more cases of cancer, because that doesn't fulfill those criteria. You have to be able to find that cancer early enough to actually change the clinical course, predictably at a population level. Back to my second slide. This is not the story of the clinician sitting across from a patient having this discussion. This is the process of putting all of those data together in order to have the conversation across our whole community. And so we need to know the natural history of the condition and understand that we can intervene in that in a timely way ahead of it becoming apparent clinically. And that there should be an agreed policy on whom to treat as patients. And you'll have seen discussion in the media this week about what we should label cancer. It's an interesting discussion, and I'm sure a discussion that will continue in the months and years ahead. So as we look at incidence of cancer in cervical cancer, we can see that mortality has dropped substantially since even before the national screening program was introduced. In incidence, we're in the dark blue, the magenta solid line, and in mortality, we can see that we have decreased that from 8 per 100,000 women per year to just 2 per 100,000 women per year. What's really exciting in this space is that very soon the WHO is going to announce its proposal for the eradication of cervical cancer. That's a big call. But when you think about what we looked at earlier in vaccine-preventable disease, this is possible. And so as we think about cervical cancer, I want to look at the rates of high-grade abnormalities when women have a Pap test. So this predates the new screening program that came in on December 1 last year. And I want to just draw your attention to a couple of really exciting things. If you're 20 to 24, already we have halved the number of high-grade abnormalities that are found on Pap tests with the vaccination program for human papillomavirus. That's extraordinary in such a short time. And we've also shifted the peak, and this is perhaps not so good for those who weren't immunised, from 20 to 24 through to 25 to 29. We know we can make a difference here. And we know that if we look at 5-year participation rates, they're actually up with some of the best in the world. Although the interval has been 2 years in our program, 89% of women in our community have had a Pap test in the last 5 years. And Finland has managed to have some of the lowest mortality rates in the world with a 5-year screening interval, which is adhered to by their community. What about the National Bowel Screening Program? You will have seen that the Cancer Institute, on behalf of the New South Wales government, had social marketing in April through to June this year on television. Why? Because 38% of people who get one of the kits in the mail actually use it. 38%. Not many. A lot of kits sitting on shelves out there, and I won't have the data for another few weeks on the outcomes of that social marketing on television, but the early indications are really positive that it will make a difference, that people are taking those kits off the shelf. They haven't thrown them out, they've just put them on the shelf. And when we had Dave O'Neill do some media for us a couple of years ago, you may have seen him on social media. I think his spin on it was, and I'd hate to misquote him, haven't you always wanted to put some poo on a stick and send it to the government? So at the end of the day, why would we engage in this? Well, we need to get screening rates up substantially. If we can do that, we're going to save 25,000 lives between now and 2040 in New South Wales. And I don't mean delay the diagnosis of cancer. I mean cure in the strictest sense of that four-letter word. That's a lot of people. I can't offer you that from any other intervention that we have in our armamentarium today. And why is that? In the dark blue here, what you have are the people whose bowel cancer was detected through a screening program. And in the light blue, you have the people whose bowel cancer was detected because they were symptomatic. And across the bottom on the x-axis, you've got the earliest stage disease that is limited to the lining of the bowel, through to the right-hand side of that same axis, where you have people where it has not only spread from the bowel, it has spread to distant sites in the body. And so what you see is that we see a shift in screening from distant spread to earlier stage and potentially curable disease. And let's face it, when we get to people at this stage, they're facing surgery, quick recovery, no further therapy, and follow-up colonoscopies just to make sure that they don't have local problems as a result. No chemotherapy, no radiotherapy, a really straightforward process. And we can double, more than double, the number of people with early stage disease diagnosed by simply encouraging everyone that you know of to use their bowel screening kit from the age of 50 to 74 every 2 years. It is that simple. And so we have at our hands, at our fingertips, things that can make an enormous difference to cancer across our community. Look at the survival rates. Again, the x-axis is exactly the same as the x-axis we just saw. If you get early stage disease, your 5-year survival is greater than 93% in our community, and that's all cause, not just cancer-specific survival. So fantastic news if we use the screening program. What about breast screen? Well, the number of participants in New South Wales has gone up fantastically, but so has our population. And so our actual rate in the dark blue line hasn't changed that much. But what we have seen is that the incidence is there for us, and the number of new cases has increased, but again, that's because of population growth. We can see that the incidence is fairly flat from the years 2000 onwards there. What's really impressive is that the mortality rate continues to fall. And so having a national breast screen program decreases mortality for women by 28%. It decreases mortality for women who actually participate in the program by 35%. It's making a huge difference. And that's taking into account all of the technological advances, all of the new medications, all of the new imaging, and even taking that into account, participating between the ages of 50 and 74 every 2 years with a free bilateral mammogram, with the images taken with state-of-the-art technology, read by 2 independent practitioners who don't compare notes, the only thing in the health system that pays for 2 readers. decreases mortality systematically across our community. What about prevention? You know, lung cancer peaked in males in the light blue line here in 1982. Because males had started, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time, to decrease their smoking rate. What you can see in the purple line here, unfortunately, however, is that the smoking rates continue to increase in women. There's still a huge differential between males and females, but they still are increasing in women. And there are our averages across the community. Mortality has been falling for more than 30 years there. And there are our smoking rates. A massive reduction from the post-war years in male smoking, which is reflected in what we really saw from the beginning of the 1980s onwards. But our current smoking prevalence is still unacceptably high. And across our community, although the rates continue to fall, and I'm delighted to say that the school-age smoking rate from 12 to 17 is 6.7%. Who was at school when it was anything like 6.7%? I know at my school it was probably about 30 to 40% through at least the senior years. A massive change across our community. And we can see that men peak their smoking in the 35 to 44-year age group. Women don't peak for another decade. Now, whether that's the effect of teenage offspring or other stressors, I'm not sure. But we do see two quite distinct patterns between males and females. What about our treatment services? I want to go on to smoking here also, because in 2014, importantly, the US Surgeon General, to commemorate the 1964 US Surgeon General's report linking smoking to lung cancer for the first time in the US, prepared a special edition of the US Surgeon General's report and commissioned work on the difference in outcomes for people who are smoking at the time they're diagnosed with cancer and manage to give up at that time, versus those who are smoking at the time they're diagnosed with cancer and continue to smoke. What's the difference? The difference is amazing. All-cause mortality and cancer-specific mortality is different by 3 years. If you give up smoking at the time you are diagnosed with cancer, you are improving your cancer outcomes as well as the chances just generally of being alive in 3 years' time. Again, I have few things in the armamentarium that can make that big a difference. And as a clinician, I have said to people, this is a really stressful time. What a dreadful time to think about giving up smoking. What a dreadful thing to say. This is now the advice that we're giving. And so we're asking cancer services across the state, are you identifying smokers? And if so, are you working with them to help give up? And we're working with the Quit Line so that there will be a separate portal into the Quit Line for people newly diagnosed with cancer to really help support them in the process of quitting. I mentioned in the Act for the Cancer Institute that improving quality of life was important, and I'm deliberately not identifying local health districts or hospitals this morning, but I do want to call out one, and this is the Mid-North Coast. This is symptom control for people seeing cancer services, and we've surveyed people in conjunction with the Bureau of Health Information for several years to ask about their experience of being treated for cancer, to ask about their symptom control. Why am I calling out Mid-North Coast? Because they're doing so well. Why are they doing so well? Because for years, every person, as they arrive, are asked to fill out their symptoms, either on paper or on an iPad. And that's with the clinician as the clinician sees that patient that day. To get green on this graph, you have to be statistically better than the rest of the state. There are 9 symptoms that are routinely checked for. And they're statistically better than the rest of the state in 4 of those symptoms. We can not only make a difference to cancer outcomes, we can make a difference to the experience of being treated for cancer in our community. What about about radiotherapy? The evidence base continues to change, and the news feeds this morning had an interesting article on the potential of new ways to deliver radiotherapy. Not yet into animal models, certainly not into humans, but very interesting science behind it. The move in radiotherapy broadly is to reduce the number of fractions of radiotherapy, the number of visits, while still maintaining outcomes. Now, in this setting, we need to remember that 28% of all radiotherapy delivered in New South Wales is for early-stage breast cancer. And so reducing the number of fractions from 25 to 16 leads to an overall reduction in the demand for radiotherapy by 8%, not only without compromising care, but potentially delivering better outcomes. There's at least one large study from the United Kingdom that suggests that not only do you get the same outcomes at 10 years, but you get better cosmesis from this, and potentially fewer side effects to normal tissue around that site of radiotherapy. So how are we doing in that? Well, again, there's variation across the state. These data are slightly old, and our best performing centre is now up to 91% for hypofractionation. But we've got services as low as 7%. And my concern is not whether that's good for the system. Is that woman actually being empowered to make the best decision for her health? Is that going to make a difference to her making a decision to have that procedure rather than, for example, having a mastectomy? These are important questions, and making sure that our community is fully informed for making those decisions, that individuals have the right information at their fingertips at a very crucial and vulnerable time of their life, is a key component of improving the health literacy across our community. We did, when we looked at these data, about 170 esophagectomies a year. Now, your esophagus connects your mouth to your stomach. And esophagectomies are one of the most horrible procedures you can do to another human being and have them come out the other side well. But it also means that you've got one bite at the cherry. You've got to get it right the first time. And so we looked at data from around the world. The largest case series is in fact almost 10 times the size of the one that's on this board, and yet nationally we do about 170 procedures a year. So we need to look to the international literature and establish whether the magnitude and direction of what we're seeing here is the same or different. So when you look, low volume centres have higher mortality, high volume centres have lower mortality. It's as simple as that. So what does it look like in New South Wales? This was the burning platform for us a few years ago. And so when we looked at these data in 2010, what did we see? We saw a twofold difference in 30-day mortality for esophagectomy, and for pancreatectomy, which requires an awful lot of replumbing during the procedure. Again, the order of magnitude was actually a threefold difference in 30-day mortality. These people are having this surgery with curative intent. You are not doing this palliatively. And if you look at 90-day mortality, the same order of magnitude is there, and 1-year conditional survival. So you add the 30-day mortality to the 1-year survival, and you've got the picture of how that unit's performing. Who wants to go to a low-volume centre? Seriously. Who is empowered to know about low-volume centres? It's on our website now. And we're working closely with organisations like the Cancer Council New South Wales to make sure that people have at their fingertips the information that will make a difference to their care. We provide this back to local health districts, primary health networks, private hospitals, specialty health networks, and people are responding because they've never had high-quality information, not data, information about their system's performance. So by providing that sort of information, we're really starting to make a difference. Esophagectomies 2005, 1 in 2 in the state was done in a centre that did less than 6 a year. And in fact, on the far left-hand side of this, you'll see those centres that did 1 a year. Now, seriously, ladies and gentlemen, who wants to go to a place that does a major procedure that can take up to 14 hours with a couple of surgeons and a team in the ward, a team in the intensive care unit, the pre-operative care that you're going to need, the allied health that you're going to need, working closely as a cohesive team, and you do it once a year? I don't. And importantly, as we look at the differences across our community, we've seen a massive reduction in that. We've seen it go from 50% of esophagectomies in New South Wales to just 6% as we've provided feedback to clinicians and the hospitals in which they work. What about intensive care time? Again, if you're doing less than 6 a year, you're going to increase substantially the time that you spend in intensive care. Now, some of my best friends are intensivists, but frankly, I want to keep them as friends, not as the people treating me. I don't want to spend a second longer in intensive care than I have to. And whether we look at the average or the median, it really doesn't matter. If you go to a low volume centre, and this is not about the surgeon, this is about the entire team. Because you need a really good dietitian, you need a fantastic physiotherapist that's prepared to get you up out of bed on day one with tubes coming out of God knows where, that you didn't even know tubes could come out of, in order to get the best possible outcomes. You need to make sure that your case has been discussed with the medical oncologists and radiation oncologists and the palliative care team before you go to theatre, before you have an operation, in order to get the best possible outcomes. And so applying the knowledge we have today can and demonstrably does improve outcomes, has that improved outcomes. We'll come to that in a second. Pancreatectomy down from 29% to just 9% in the same time periods. Why are pancreatectomies so tough? Well, your pancreas has lots of digestive enzymes in. And the bottom line is, once they start leaking, you get autodigestion. You actually get your body being digested if there is a leak in the plumbing after you have that procedure. You need to do this with someone who does it as often as possible and is an absolute gun. So, has it made a difference? Absolutely. The other thing that we've added, and we're one of the few groups in the world that has added this, is to go back to the postcode. What do I mean by that? What are the chances of you having a procedure by postcode? And we found something really interesting. Overall, the proportion of people having a pancreatectomy in New South Wales is increasing. And I had a fascinating conversation, which of course cannot leave this room, with two surgeons from adjacent local health districts, both head of surgery. And they were respectively the lowest proportion in the state and the highest proportion in the state. And the conversation went something like this. You guys are cowboys. You're operating on too many people, and clearly that will be reflected in your early mortality and your late mortality. To which the response was, you guys are, and I won't use the vernacular that was used in that meeting, they were pulling no punches that day, you are not operating on enough people because you don't have the referral networks and you're stepping away from people with potentially curative disease. So we went away and did the analysis because it's really important. And what did we find? We found that there was variation across the state, but again, things were generally heading in the right direction. So like that earlier slide, the grey diamonds here are 2009 to 2012 in this case, and the blue diamonds are 2013 to 2016. Now, we expect that esophageal cancer will actually go down a little because other therapies are now being used for locally advanced disease. But all of the others, with the exception of gastric cancer, are heading exactly where we would expect them to head. But again, we see wide variation across the state in the blue that has us say, so what else is going on? So here is on the x-axis, and I want to spend just a couple of minutes on this. The x-axis is the percentage of people who have a resection by postcode of local health district, so where they live. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we see their 5-year survival. So what is the answer to the conversation between those two surgeons? Who was right? The surgeon who accused his colleague of being a cowboy, or the other surgeon who accused his colleague of being something unmentionable this morning? Who wants to have a quick vote? You've got the data in front of you. First surgeon right? Second surgeon right? Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you're in a local health district with a low volume centre, you're less likely to be offered a procedure, and you're less likely to be offered a procedure which is likely to be curative. You're also more likely to spend time in ICU, intensive care unit. You're more likely to spend time with a 30-day mortality rate that is higher, a 90-day mortality rate that is higher, a 1-year survival that is lower, and a 5-year survival that is lower. We know we can make a difference. What about lung cancer? Lung cancer, particularly early stage diseases, is treated with either surgery or radiotherapy. And we started with surgery, and we've more recently had the radiotherapy data to add to that, the light blue, as it were. And in all of our data, we try and adjust for major factors that can help us ensure that we're comparing like with like. So in the black dots, we've got our ultimate estimates of treatment across lung cancer. And as we look at that, what we see is if you're well enough to have surgery, you do well. If you're not well enough to have surgery, you have radiotherapy. And if you're not well enough to have either, your outlook is pretty grim. What concerns me is that we know that there are people who have early stage disease where we can't find anything using linked electronic databases that identifies that they would not be candidates for definitive surgery, or failing that, definitive radiotherapy. So these three lines are not comparing like with like. But importantly, there are people, and the data from Queensland is that that rate may be as high as 30%. We can make an enormous difference to cancer outcomes today by systematically putting in place the things that we know work. So if we look at 24 months, you can see the enormous difference from somewhere just under a 90% survival for surgery to somewhere about 65% for no surgery to something just over 20% if you have no therapy at all. We can make a difference. And finally, I just want to touch on cancer research and clinical trials in particular, because it is a success story in New South Wales that is almost unprecedented. Clinical trials are tremendously important for us. From the pipeline that does the preclinical work in the laboratory, in animal models, and then into phase 1 studies. We have a number of funding streams that we run for the New South Wales government in cancer research. And one of them is our translational program grants. They're a substantial investment by government in established research teams. And again, a bit like esophageal surgery, research in 2018 is a team event. It is no longer the brilliant single mind in a dark garret coming up with great ideas. One of the translational program grants we funded went through to first-in-human studies. It was a scientist, not a clinician, who had made the breakthrough. Totally new class of anti-cancer medication. And there is a photo, which I don't have, and I wish I had for you today, of him sitting from Sydney, but the work for getting it into humans was done overseas, sitting at the bedside, actually sitting on the bed of the first patient who was about to get his medication. First in human. And I cannot tell you that a face actually can mix ecstasy and abject terror all at once. It was a most amazing photo. Our clinical research is crucial to improving the future. In that third slide of mine, I wasn't diminishing the bright, the shiny, the new. But I am saying we've got so much that we already have at our fingertips that we can put in place in order to improve things. So phase 1 is traditionally first in human. Phase 2 is really looking for a signal that there may be some benefit here, some net benefit. We've got to take into account the benefits and the burdens of anything. Phase 3, much larger studies. And finally, phase 4, how does it behave in the real world? And this takes time. But at the end of the day, in New South Wales, the great news is the number of trials available to people are increasing. And importantly, the number of people participating in clinical trials is increasing at a rate that is unprecedented. And it's increasing because we're working with researchers so that 8 out of every 100 people newly diagnosed with cancer will be on a clinical trial in New South Wales. Those rates are unprecedented internationally. At the end of the day, it's across the spectrum of cancer, with neurological cancers actually leading the way. And again, that may not have been the impression you've had from the media over the past couple of years. But other really important cancers right across the spectrum of cancer control. Ultimately, we have at our fingertips things that can make an enormous difference to cancer outcomes. The knowledge that we share in the community for good health literacy around cancer is crucial. The lifestyle decisions that we make are absolutely profound in terms of our cancer risk. The way we structure the health system in which to deliver that care is making enormous difference to cancer outcomes in New South Wales today. I want to leave you with this thought today. The bottom line is there will be people drinking champagne on New Year's Eve this year because of changes that are being made in the health system today. Very few places in the world can say that in the way that we can say that in New South Wales this August. I'm happy to take some questions or comments.
Hi, Michelle Venice. Sorry. I just wanted to ask what happens to the trials, the checks when you're over 70? Because a lot of those things like the breast cancer checks and the cervical cancer stopped around 69, 70, 72.
So nationally, the question was what happens to people who want checks after the age of 70? The national programs now go to 74, and the opportunity to continue after that is there. It's just that people have to make that decision actively themselves. It's there, and people should avail themselves of it. You know, if you want some interesting evening reading, look at the actuarial life tables. You know, if you make it to 70, you've actually done a lot away with a lot of the competition, and your life expectancy is fantastically good. So do think about your health and the decisions you make at that time.
Professor Kuro, most fascinating talk. I came here this morning. I'm an engineer, so I thought, well, it might not be relevant, but I came here for reassurance. And every year I have to see my cardiologist, my neurologist, my gastrointestinal, blah, blah, blah. It keeps going on. And it costs me a fortune. I want to ask if you can foresee a diagnostic test somewhere in our, whatever, our DNA or all these little things that can isolate these things without this constant round and the high cost of diagnosis.
Yeah. We can probably talk after and reduce that list of people you need to see in the first place. But having done that, your question still stands. Look, clearly there are enormous advances being made, and I think what we haven't got is the lowest common denominator as we think about cancer. We've got lots of mechanisms, and cancer is many hundreds of diseases under one umbrella. Can we find a single, simple pathway for that? At the moment, the answer is no. But that is the Holy Grail, and I can assure you that there are thousands of scientists around the world who are going to work right now with a view to finding exactly that.
First of all, thank you for your very thorough and fascinating presentation. I noted on one of your charts that the chance of surviving ovarian cancer is approximately 40%. I was curious to know, there was nothing on the chart about testicular cancer. Is that because it's a relatively rare occurrence, or is it just an omission?
We didn't list all the cancers. I could go right off the bottom of the slide and actually through to the basement if I'm going to list everything. Look, an enormous contrast between them. Testicular cancer these days for early stage disease has a 98% 5-year survival. It's one of the great success factors in modern cancer. The introduction of a medication 35 years ago called cisplatin revolutionised the treatment of that disease, even when it had spread beyond the testis. By contrast, you know, we've got one of the world experts in ovarian cancer screening here today, and it's not me. You know, the Holy Grail has still really eluded us there. The symptoms often mimic other symptoms. They're non-specific. We don't have a screening test. The science there has to move ahead to fulfill those criteria we saw from the World Health Organization criteria on screening. You know, an important contribution from New South Wales was made by Royal Hospital for Women when they looked at 2 case series. The case series of women who presented with late-stage disease, and they asked those women, for how long have you had symptoms? And they looked at a case series of women who presented with early-stage disease and said, for how long have you had symptoms? And the answer, sadly, was that they were symptomatic for an almost identical period of time. So we don't get early clinical warning, we have no early scientific warning at the moment, and once disease is established, you have already commented on the outcomes that we can achieve at this time.
Thank you.
Hi there. If there is a case where breast cancer, stage 2 or 3, had spread to the lymph gland, this was actually a relative of mine had surgery, and I was wondering, do we have any idea on the mortality rate after they have lymph gland cancer?
So it depends whether that was discovered at the time of the surgery and how that was treated. Importantly, removing those lymph nodes doesn't change outlook. What it does is change our understanding of whether the cancer has spread or not. And if it has, the outlook, particularly with post-operative radiotherapy to that area, is still extremely good in 2018.
Professor, cancer, as we know, is a global, well, I won't say phenomenon, but challenge. With the work that you're doing here in New South Wales, do you see that there is active collaboration, proactive collaboration coming to New South Wales from either domestically, because there's a lot of work being done in Victoria, or internationally from other key cancer research centres around the world?
Look, again, cancer research in 2018 is a team sport, and great cancer researchers are great collaborators by definition. Those collaborations reach right across the globe, and I think any area that you see where New South Wales is leading, you will see that we are collaborating closely, particularly with Northern Europe, North America, across Australia, and now more and more into the investments that are being made in Southeast Asia. You know, the investments in Singapore are enormous. South Korea is also developing cancer research. I think the challenge for us is that what I've presented today is a very positive picture, and it is genuinely the case. in New South Wales. The challenge is that, you know, when I talk of eradicating cervical cancer, it's still the #1 killer from cancer for women in many countries. So with all of our work, I believe that we have an ethical obligation to make sure that it is not just addressing the issues that we face, but that cancer faces globally.
Hi. Can I ask about the whether there's any plans from the New South Wales on genetic diagnosis of cancer and screening? We are one of the labs that provides genetic diagnosis on solid tumours, and we just want to see, you know, where we're heading in the next 5-10 years.
Well, we're heading into exciting waters in the next 5 to 10 years. Unprecedented investment by the New South Wales government through the Genomics Consortium, unprecedented investment by the New South Wales federal government and the Australian Cancer Research Foundation in proteomics, making New South Wales a destination of choice for both. And Roger Adele, who's leading the proteomics work, is here this morning. Extraordinary work, and you put those two together and you start to get whole new fingerprints relating to cancer at both a population level and at an individual level. So, you know, I think we will see continued commitment to that sort of investment with the process of accelerating the pipeline from a research base to really making a difference in clinical care. And if we look at both paediatric and adult cancers, we're seeing that actually put into practice today in people who have exhausted the other more conventional options for systemic treatment. I'm really excited to see the results that are coming out of the Garvan and look forward to that being amplified in the years ahead. One last question, just down here.
I've heard that there is some news about cannabis being helpful to certain cancers. Do you have any research or any case treatments on those?
Yeah, look, I was part of a systematic review that was published, admittedly, a while ago, but it really showed no anti-cancer effect other than theoretically in the laboratory. We certainly have not seen that in vivo, and I think, again, within a context of expectation management, the medicinal properties of cannabis, be it the active agents of tetrahydrocannabinol or cannabidiol, need to be brought into perspective because I don't think we're going to see the explosion of therapies that many people are hoping for at the moment.
Thank you, David. I hope everyone would join me in thanking David for his wonderful talk. And we've got a gift, David.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next breakfast seminar is on the 10th of October, and it's Associate Professor Murian Irish talking about memory in dementia, past, present and future. I hope to see you all then. Thank you.